Welcome to Lawline with your host, David Schnurman, an accomplished entrepreneur, attorney, and legal educator. Each week, Lawline will bring you the most knowledgeable experts in the field of law, business, and education. And now we introduce our guest and our host, David Schnurman.
Hello, I'm David Schnurman, and welcome to Lawline. The Occupy Wall Street movement in New York and throughout the country has sparked numerous allegations of police brutality, combined with recent allegations of New York City police officers committing rape and the ticket fix scandal. The public will no longer tolerate misconduct at any level. Today we'll look at the truth behind these allegations and what the police community is doing to remedy them. We have with us attorney John Patten, who represents police officers, as well as attorney Edward Friedman, whose clients include victims of police brutality. Hello, John. Hello, Ed.
Hello, how are you?
Hey, good, David. Thanks for being here today. Let's start with the Occupy Wall Street movement, John.
Okay.
You look at the videotape, not only in New York, but all across the country, in Oakland and everywhere. You see lots of video that seems like police brutality, and of course there's a lot of allegations going on there. What do you think is happening, and how do you see these protests in the larger scheme of things?
Well, the protests I think are fine. I think they're good to have. The police reaction to that, other than the one instance of the inspector with the pepper spray, I think the police response here, at least in New York, has been a very reasonable response. It's not been over the top. People are refusing sometimes to follow a direct order, like at the Brooklyn Bridge. You have to clear it. I don't see that anyone used excessive force whatsoever there. So for the most part, I think the police response to Occupy Wall Street has been very, very favorable down here in New York.
And it seems like we're getting into, it's only growing here, and there's a lot of people talking about lots of different protests, and you see what's gone on in other countries. From your own personal point of view, where do you see this going, and what's your opinion in terms of the police reaction to that, and if things will keep growing and get worse?
Well, I think that, there's evidence out there that the movement's going to grow. And that growth, as far as whether it's going to stay nonviolent and non-confrontational, I think is going to depend largely on the police reaction to it, and to some extent on the reaction of the demonstrators. And if you could, David, in different areas of the country, like Oakland, and at least it appears now in Atlanta, I think there's been probably, it's hard to know if it's the demonstrators are more violent or more active in terms of confronting the police. But from the point of view of New York, I think one of the problems we have is we don't know if the particular officers are getting constant and consistent instructions on how to handle it.
Sure.
It seems like we're going back and forth.
A lot of them are
right.
When you see the videotape, they haven't been in this situation before, and they're not sure what to do. We went down there, it's right by our offices, with a camera, and just started interviewing. And you saw a lot of police officers who seemed, from my opinion, uncomfortable and weren't sure what to do.
Well, the apparent discomfort is they're not certain as to how to respond, because I think a lot of the officers are not adverse to what's taking place there. There's a dialogue going on between the demonstrators and the Occupy Wall Street folks and the officers. You go down there's a certain sense of friendliness between them. It's only when you're called upon to leave the compound, more or less, and go out.
We're calling it a compound now.
Well,
yeah,
I'll call it what I call it.
Yeah.
But I mean,
if you've seen it, there's some aspects to that.
It's a very interesting situation, and I think the police officers have responded well to it. They're not that enemy. Neither side are enemies one to the other. It's when they, as I say, leave the compound. When they leave Zuccotti Park and go to the demonstration.
Sure. Something's going to happen.
Something's going to happen, yeah. And the response has not been excessive in the use of force. I don't believe so.
I don't disagree. I think that as of now, in terms of the police response, and as John said, there was the incident with the pepper spray. Then there was the incident when the demonstrators walked towards the Brooklyn Bridge. But it's a fine line between there are probably laws that are broken all the time, and it's a fine line for the officers to know when to enforce and when not to enforce. And then the problems I see is that what we're getting sometimes from the mayor or the police commissioner are conflicting sets of instructions or conflicting roles. 1 minute it seems that Mayor Bloomberg is, wants to let them stay, and then there's orders and edicts that they have to leave so that the park can be clean.
He seems to be between a rock and a hard place.
It's
though.
a tough situation.
And certainly there's parties who potentially do want violence. They do want police to be aggressive. They do want there to be
They want confrontation.
They want confrontation.
They're not getting it, though. I mean, with the police, it seems to me that Brooklyn Bridge incident, okay, caused additional people now to focus on Occupy Wall Street and want to come there, okay? But the response at the Brooklyn Bridge was not at all excessive. I don't believe so, given the people's desire to get arrested. That's what they went up there to get, basically to provoke this confrontation between themselves and the police department.
Let me bring this to a bigger picture, and then we can come
Sure.
back to Occupy Wall Street.
Sure.
John, when do you, someone who represents police officers, certainly you can't say that police misconduct doesn't happen and the police don't get too aggressive. When have you seen that happen, and how does that happen in a certain situation?
Police misconduct itself?
In terms of lots of things happening. People are human. And
Well, this past week was a very difficult week for the police commissioner, at least within the past 10 days. You had a number of different things happening at the same time. You had the Bell case at police headquarters on trial. You had the arrest of those officers in the gun smuggling situation. You had a narcotics case being tried in Brooklyn where there was claims of police corruption. And then you had the ticket fixing thing. They all came together in one particular time period here for presence and population in the public's mind. Those cases are separate and apart, but they all happened this 1 week. And you can see in Commissioner Kelly's face the tremendous disappointment and sadness, because there are a lot of very, very good policewomen out there, and you have those who are not. So I don't think there's a cop out there today who would condone the gun smuggling thing.
Sure.
Or would condone flaking people in an arrest, okay? Who would condone the alleged rape of that woman, okay, in Manhattan. My reaction or the discussion with officers, they're as offended by that as anything else. And when it comes to those type of things happening all at the same time, there's a public perception that there's something radically wrong with this department, and I don't think that's the case. I think they're doing okay. They're not doing great, but they're doing all right.
I don't know, John, if you intentionally left out the ticket fixing.
No, I didn't.
But no, you didn't. You kept it in there. But when you're talking about other police officers' reaction.
To those who don't know what the ticket fixing scandal is, can you guys just give a brief overview?
I have one of those defendants in that case.
Ah.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, maybe you should explain.
No, you go ahead.
Well, there's an allegation. It's a case that's now being prosecuted in the Bronx that there were officers who were fixing tickets. They were in some way, and I mean I've kind of read the indictment. I don't know all the facts.
No,
but
parking tickets, speeding tickets.
Yeah.
Any type of tickets.
Right.
Okay.
And that there were 16 officers involved. A lot of them, I believe, were union delegates. At this point, of course, they're presumed innocent. They've been charged. But what I found somewhat disturbing was the fact that when the case, I think the case was on last week for arraignment, and maybe John was there. Maybe I wasn't. But what I read about in the newspaper was that there were dozens of police officers there who were not involved in the ticket fixing scheme. And again, we don't know what happened or how it happened. Obviously, there was enough evidence to print to the grand jury. Those wagons were circled. There were union delegates there. I don't know if the union president Lynch was there.
Oh, he was there.
And I heard things from officers, and I read quotes that said that they weren't denying that it took place, but saying, well, this was the way things were done. So I think there was a circling of the wagons there.
Well, let me correct you, there was about 500 policemen there. It was a very, very interesting support for their brother officers. Pat Lynch was there, the PBA president. His board was there, the various officers. There's a perception amongst the uniformed force on this ticket fixing situation where this is something that had gone on for years And I even heard someone say once that if you can't fix a ticket in New York, it's time to move away.
Just to be clear to
Go
those
ahead.
who don't know what this is, what do you mean by fixing a ticket?
Well,
I just want to make sure everyone understands what's going on here.
You get a ticket, driving a vehicle. You go through a red light or you're speeding, okay? You get a traffic violation, a speeding violation, moving violation, okay? There's been a tradition within New York, custom and usage, where people reach out to try and
To friends who are police officers.
Yeah, to try and do something about not having to face that ticket.
That's common, sure.
It's been going on for years, and what's offending the officers is that they feel the rank and file is taking a hit on this thing, where the bosses are not,
And they knew about
the
it the whole time.
politicians are not, and even had a lieutenant fix it at headquarters. There would be tickets that would be legally corrected.
How did this get put in the public eye?
Well, there was a very bad situation of a narcotics, marijuana situation involving one police officer. And I did a number of wiretaps in my career. And wiretapping has a tendency to keep going out and expanding.
The governor can attest to that.
Yeah, and there's a conversation comes over where someone requests that could this officer do him a favor? Could he take care of a ticket of X, Y, or Z who got a ticket? And then they hear this and they make a big deal out of it. Now, I'm not excusing it, but they make a big deal out of it and they then start to wiretap these conversations.
Sure.
And it's usually people within the lower ranks that are doing the alleged fixing. There's no crime of
Sure.
ticket fixing. It's what is it?
It's an official misconduct?
Misconduct is the crime. Yeah.
But you can't say, John. You can't say, well, listen, everybody does it. It's part of the course, and then arrest 50,000 kids for smoking weed, right? You know, when that's technically illegal, sure, right?
Right,
But
right.
everybody does it. So
Right.
these same officers who are circling the wagons,
Right.
Circling the wagons because, well, these people were doing these illegal things, but everybody was doing it. Well, what about the African American kid, or the Hispanic kid, or the white kid who's smoking a joint,
Right, okay.
Who's arrested, put
Everybody's
through the
doing
system.
it. Yeah, I see what you're
Everybody's
saying.
doing it. Right?
Everybody's smoking
Everybody's
weed.
walking. They arrest people for walking between cars on a train. They actually
I see the
arrest them.
Oh, they
signs.
do.
I see
They
the
arrest
I
signs.
had a client with
Right.
that.
They
yeah.
put them through the system. They might have to spend 24 hours in jail, but
Yeah.
everybody does it, so why not? So how can you make an excuse because
Well,
somebody
nobody's excusing it. This is, I'm saying you're trying to appreciate where they're coming from, what their feelings are, and how they feel oppressed by. All of a sudden now we're going to start prosecuting a custom and usage that went on in this city for years.
That's what my clients who come to me, who may have, had a beer in a paper bag and
Okay.
get arrested. They may feel the same way.
Same way.
They
okay.
feel the same
So
way.
That's
So-
legitimate.
Unfortunately, when they go
So
to
what-
court for their arraignment, there's not 500 other people who had
Well,
open
they're not
bottle
there's
convictions.
not the part of the marijuana smokers union.
That's
There's
true.
a PBA out there, and they have support
But
for
in-
their
John,
membership.
in every case, and you're talking about cases where there's allegations of police officers raping or stealing or getting involved in corruption in any ways or framing people, there's always somebody that's also being charged for covering it up.
No, wait. Time out a minute. In those instances you just told me, you're not going to have 500 police officers there supporting the police officers who got involved in this business. You take the case of the alleged rape in Manhattan, you didn't have the support of 400 or 500 officers coming there. This was a systemic thing throughout the department.
Let's talk about that for a minute
Okay,
here.
sure.
Do you know the details of that, John?
I followed it in the newspapers
Sure.
like most lawyers would around here.
So-
It's
so-
a fascinating case. I
So
know
from
both
what I
lawyers who tried it.
understand, and correct me if I'm wrong here, they walked her home and had sex with her, or something.
That was the claim.
And then she alleges that it was rape.
Correct. That's correct.
How does something like that even happen, from your experience?
Well, I tell you, it happens frequently enough where, not that you have the rape claim, but you have instances where there are contacts between officers and people who are intoxicated coming home, say. And too frequently, there'd be overstepping the line, perhaps. This particular case was especially egregious because these fellows came back. The woman claimed that she was raped, and I happened to follow that case quite a bit, and was quite surprised at the final result was. I mean, a lot of people were, that both these officers were acquitted of that. I don't want to judge them, but at the same time, the officers that are out there today would never condone that kind of behavior. It happened.
But there's something, you have to say something also about the fact that it seems, in this case, I think there was a jury trial.
There was a jury trial.
Oftentimes juries are waived, like the case in Brooklyn with Judge Reichbeck. But what happens is, it seems that it's very rare that an officer who's charged with even the most egregious kind of misconduct ever is convicted of the main crime or the most serious crime he's charged with.
Well, having defended a number of policemen in trials, I believe there's a basic goodwill towards the officers, that if there's a benefit of doubt, they'll get the benefit of a doubt with a jury. That's been earned over time.
Sure.
And in that particular case, the system worked. The jury followed the instructions of the judge. It was beyond a reasonable doubt. There was a significant reasonable doubt, and they acquitted. A lot of people were upset by that, but that's how the system is set forth, and it was followed.
Sure. No, when you hear allegations of rape and you hear what you've heard in the media, you're missing something. We're gonna take a break right now. We're gonna continue this conversation. And it's lots of interesting, important topics that we're discussing. You're watching Lawline. Stay with us.
I'm bored. I can go ride my bike.
It may never be this easy to help your kids find balance, but you have more power than you know. For a free Parent's Handbook plus other resources, visit the We Can website. A message from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.
The smallest moments can have the biggest impact on a child's life. Take time to be a dad today.
Hi, I'm David Schnurman. You're watching Lawline. Today's topic is on police misconduct. Our guests are John Patten, who represents police officers, and Edward Friedman, who represents victims of police brutality. Before the break, we were discussing first the ticket scandal, then we went to the alleged rape charge. There's a lot of things that are common practice that we're talking about. Of course, attempted rapes is way beyond a ticket scandal. But going back to that, what is the consequences here? What are we talking about? Is it losing their job? Is it jail time? Is it fines? What are we talking about
here? The consequences
of the ticket scandal.
Of the ticket scandal. It was interesting. First of all, you had about 2 or 3 years of continued, repeated...
2 to 3 years of wiretapping?
No, not of wiretapping, but it was at least 2 years of press releases or leaks. It was constantly in the newspapers. The fact that there was this massive ticket fixing case going on in the Bronx, okay, that was the story, and then who was involved in it and what have you. When we actually went up there that day and we faced the charges, the counsel for the main guy said, "Is this it?" And most of us had a similar kind of reaction. I mean, people were charged with misdemeanors. The officers, they were the paper felonies, these felonies that are darling of the prosecutor these days, official offering an instrument for filing false business records. I mean, they're on the books, they're to be enforced, but they're kind of like attached to the main event here. They become the main event.
Ed, you were talking about, this is just, fine, this is the usual thing, and well, doesn't mean it's not illegal. In your cases that you've taken civilly against the police department, do you find that's a common, that brotherhood type thing where, what happened was not that big a deal, and it wasn't really brutality. It was just part of the normal things that police conduct is.
That's in terms of the defenses that were offered by the city. Usually what will happen is I'll bring a case or a claim based on for a client who says either that they were arrested without probable cause falsely and in prison for a particular period of time, or in certain cases where there was claims of excessive force, which would be tantamount to battery or assault. And in terms of kind of circling the wagons, I think in my cases there isn't often a lot of situation where you're going to have a packed courtroom of people.
Sure.
Most of the cases don't even go to trial. But the law, in many cases, does give police officers a certain amount of leeway. And it's understandable. But the law also sets forth guidelines. And when it comes to taking a civilian and pulling them off a street, and in some cases handcuffing them or roughing them up, what it'll generally come down to is some claim that there was a resisting, and that might lead to some injury, and then sometimes that resisting leads to the imprisonment, and so the citizen, some oftentimes law-abiding. Some of the folks that I represent have some have minor records, and then the question then becomes, what is the city's defense and how we resolve the matter.
Do you see, when in your case, police misconduct more as a lack of training, more as being caught up in the situation, or actually malintent?
I think it's a little bit of both, or all three, I should say.
I don't agree with that at all. I don't.
Well, don't you think, John? There's this whole thing. There have been more stop and frisks in the Bloomberg-Kelly administration. It's on up exponentially.
What do you mean by stop and frisk?
All right. When I say that, I mean you go. Police officers are in a neighborhood. They may be in plain clothes, or they may be in uniform. And what happens is they go up to people they may suspect of possessing a gun, possessing drugs, possessing some contraband. They go up to them, oftentimes without probable cause or without reasonable suspicion. Those are the standards. And they stop
probable
them.
cause, is not the standard. It's reasonable suspicion.
It is.
It's reasonable suspicion.
But they don't have it, John.
Well, I don't agree with you. I also represent police officers down at the Civilian Complaint Review Board. The number of instances that come down on the stop and frisk, which is really like a pat down. Frisk is not a great word. I prefer the patting him down to see if he has a weapon, okay? Frisk is an unclear term. But the number of those cases that come down there that are absolutely false is amazing. Yeah. And they come through the CCRB and they end up unsubstantiated claims brought against police officers. John, this is what I see. Yeah, I'm there.
You're there, and I know people who've been on the Civilian Complaint Review Board and have told me it's a rubber stamp for the police department.
No, it's not at all that.
And I've had that in part of my experience.
It's not at all
a rubber stamp for the police department.
That's your view.
I don't even advise clients to go to the Civilian Complaint Review Board because it's useless. It's absolutely useless. What happens is that what the police department does is they send out rookie cops to go into neighborhoods, and what'll happen is there'll be usually teenage kids of color. They go into the neighborhoods, they do massive stop and frisk. Statistics show it. There's a lawsuit pending in the federal court now brought by the ACLU.
But certainly if you do a stop and frisk, it can lead to more situations because it leads to a confrontation.
Sure it does. It's the contact between the officer and the citizenry, the individual, okay? That's where you're going to have this tension between the two groupings. But if the officer has some reasonable basis to make the stop, and I find that in most of the instances, 90% or more, they do.
What is generally a reasonable basis?
Well, you can see it's the late hour, the furtive movement of the individual, looking into a vehicle, looking into a second vehicle, sees the police officer, he starts to fast walk away. Those are the kind of circumstances that raise up the police officer's suspicion. That's their instinct. And I don't agree that they take young rookie cops and send them into neighborhoods at all. The complaints that end up down at the Civilian Complaint Review Board are complaints against officers that have some experience.
John, what they create is a system by which young cops, young police officers who go out into the street, right?
Go ahead.
Do not, the people they're there to protect, there's a dehumanization. They're told that that certain members of the community in New York, African American, Hispanic, that these folks are out there. They're told, and I believe they are trained to believe. They are trained. Such a thing? They are trained to say, "Listen, we've got to get the guns off the street. We got to get the drugs off the street."
Okay.
And now you're talking about furtive movements.
Yeah.
You're talking about looking into a car, and I'm talking about statistics. I'm talking about why is it, John? Why is it that all of a sudden in the last 4 or 5 years there's been this proliferation in the number of stop and frisks, because these records are kept, and the police department actually has been trying to hide these records.
I don't know about that, but I do know that
it's dehumanized. And what happens is, so the police officers come in, they stop and frisk, there's some encounter. Why are you stopping me? I've had clients come into my office who tell me they're 16, 17 years old. They come in with their parents and they said they've been stopped and frisked and questioned 7, 8, 9 times in their lives by the time they're 18 years old.
Well, I don't know what you're talking about when you say that.
John, I'm going to give you the last word because we're wrapping up here.
Oh, okay. As far as stop and frisk goes, my sense of what the police officers are doing, they're not profiling people. They're in tough neighborhoods. They're there late at night. They see circumstances that raise them up, and they then confront that person. And they're told by their superiors to stop and frisk. And that has made our society a lot safer. Now, there are going to be complaints about that. But for the most part, it's been, I submit to you, a successful campaign by Police Commissioner Kelly for the safety of the people of the city. And I think it's been criticized justifiably sometimes, but for the most part, successful.
John, thank you for taking the time. Ed, thank you.
Thanks,
Edward, thank
David.
you for this is a really important topic, and I really appreciate you both sharing. And I look forward to discussing it more in the future. And once again, thank you for watching Lawline. We'll be here same time next week.
You've been watching Lawline with your host, David Schnurman. Mr. Schnurman will be back with you next week at the same time. If you have any questions about this week's program, please send an email to info@lawline.com.